Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. If you want to be the best at something, you have to decide that you're going to do it. If you want to be the best basketball player in the world, you have to decide you're going to do it. And from a young age, probably 3 or 4, you have to start practicing, dribbling a ball, shooting it around, figuring out how to pass and how to get open, and how to set a pick. If you really want to be the best in the world, you'd have to start realistically at age 3 or 4. If you want to be the best baseball player or the best football player or the best soccer player, you're going to have to start dribbling that ball at age 3 or 4. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to catch up. You just won't, because other kids are starting at 3 and 4, and then you're going to have to continue. You're going to have to be practicing for 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 hours a day. You're going to have to be on all the traveling teams. Your parents are going to have enough money to come and watch you play, or maybe not watch you, because let's face it, you're going to be playing a lot. If you really want to be the best, that's what it's going to have to take. And even then, there's no guarantee. You might have a terrible injury that could ruin all of it. If you wanted to be an Olympic gymnast, you would have to start at about age 3 or 4 and practice every day for hours and hours. And even then, there's no guarantee. Because maybe at the qualifiers, maybe all of a sudden you're sick that day. Maybe you take one bad step and you snap an ankle. One little misstep and you lose 0.02 points, and all of a sudden you're off the team. That sort of thing can happen. But if you thought it was worth it, if you really wanted to be on that team, if you wanted to be that person, you would work as hard as you possibly could. Now, that's not the way that life goes for most of us. We don't have time to be the best at anything, and so we settle for being pretty good at a number of things. We have to raise children, we have to work at a job, we have to cut the grass, we have to take care of our homes, we have to take our car in for an oil change. There's a lot of stuff we have to do, and we just can't be the best at all of it. And I guess that's just sort of the way that life goes. But if you wanted to be the best, you'd have to keep on going. If you wanted to be the best poet, you'd have to start at a young age and write poetry and be considered as serious, and then people will start looking at your poetry that you produce, the books that you write, the fact that you get published in the paper, and say, this person knows what they're talking about. They have a deeper meaning to these words. And words that would seem silly or nonsensical all of a sudden are interpreted as being wise and full of depth of insight. Now, I was going through some old high school notebooks that I had, and I found some poems that I wrote. And I will not tell you what any of them were, because they were terrible. There was one that was about the moon or something at night, and then I think there was one that was about a wolf or a lizard or something. I don't know what it was, but it was terrible. That's the point. At the time, I thought it was very deep and introspective, but probably all my classmates were writing similar things. If only we had started when we were younger, maybe we could be accepted. And if people say, they're really serious, they know what they're talking about, they've experienced life, they have something to tell me, so I'm going to try and figure out what their words mean. Now, we know that when Jesus uses figures of speech, when he tells parables, he has a point to them. He's trying to communicate something to us. The people who were around when he was there, they didn't. They didn't think that. They thought he was crazy. They thought he was saying nonsense. And that's once again what they think here. But we understand. We understand what Jesus is saying. It's very simple. It's plain as day. When he says, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. We know what it means. You looked at the front of the bulletin. You know what it's talking about. It's talking about the Lord's Supper. Except it's not. I mean, sort of. Jesus sort of, but no, but not. I mean, kind of. He's kind of mentioning, but no, he's not talking about it. Sort of. And my guess is right now you're sitting there and being very skeptical. You don't believe me. It's plain as day. He's talking about the flesh and drinking the blood. That sounds a lot like communion. That sounds like what he's talking about. But in a sense, he's not. All right, you don't believe me? I'll explain myself. The book of John does not have the night when Jesus gave his disciples Holy Communion for the first time. It doesn't. Matthew has it, Mark has it, Luke has it. It's even recorded in 1 Corinthians, but it's not here in the book of John. John wrote his gospel long after the other writers wrote theirs. We already knew about it. He didn't need to tell us about it again, so he wrote about different things. Now, at the time when this happened in Jesus' ministry, it was the second year of his ministry. This was not when Holy Communion was instituted. That was more than a year in the future. So Jesus was not establishing communion right now. And if he was telling the people to do something that they had no idea what it could be. He was telling them, do this right now, and by the way, you don't know what it is, and you can't possibly know what it is, but you should be doing it right now. I find it hard to believe that Jesus would put that burden on people's consciences. But maybe you're not convinced quite yet. Let's look at the language that is used here in John chapter 6. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man. Does that word sound familiar? Flesh. Well, it should be because it's used other places in John, but it's actually not the word that Jesus uses when he's talking about Holy Communion. And if you look up the account in Matthew, and in Mark, and in Luke, and in 1 Corinthians, none of them use the word flesh. They all use the word body instead. Jesus is using a different word. And he even uses a different word when he's talking about his blood. Sure, he mentions the word blood. But in Matthew, and in Mark, and in Luke, and in 1 Corinthians, he not only says blood, he says, I'm establishing a new covenant. This is different. This is something that you haven't had before. He doesn't use those words here. And maybe you're still not convinced. I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to go a few verses past our reading. I'm going to even go into the text for our sermon next Sunday. I'm not going to spoil it. But Jesus is talking and trying to explain to his disciples what he meant. And in verse 63, he says, the Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life. If Jesus was just talking about Holy Communion, talking about his flesh, and then he said the flesh means nothing, well, then he just said that Holy Communion is worthless. Jesus wouldn't say that. So it seems that he's not talking about Holy Communion. And if you read through the rest of the book of John, you'll notice that there's a similar theme that keeps coming up over and over again. Throughout the book of John, Jesus is talking over and over again about faith. In John chapter 1, he mentions the word flesh once again. John 1 verse 14, he says, John wrote, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father. John is testifying about what he has seen so that we might believe. At the very end of the book of John, John writes about the reason why he wrote the book of John in the first place. He says, I didn't tell you everything that Jesus ever did. If I did, I would fill up the world with books because Jesus did so many incredible things. But these things are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Over and over again in the book of John, we see the theme of belief and faith in finding our salvation in that. In John chapter 6, Jesus says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Jesus had been talking about being the bread of life. After the feeding of the 5,000, when all the people wanted bread, Jesus said, forget about that bread. I am the bread of life. And if you keep on reading the book of John, Jesus keeps on saying, I am something. And he says that to teach us something about faith and belief and salvation. In John chapter 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I'm not a literal shepherd. I don't literally have sheep, but I care for you like you were my sheep. I'm watching over you. Then Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep. I'm the way that the sheep must pass through. What does that mean? Jesus is talking about faith. You can't get to the Father except through Jesus. Later on, Jesus says to his disciples on the night he was betrayed, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. What does that mean? We have to be connected to Jesus in faith. And unless we are, we will not produce the sort of fruit that he's looking for. So over and over and over again, the book of John is about faith. And when Jesus calls himself the bread of life, he is also talking about faith. And it's worth noting that the people didn't believe him. If we look back at a previous section from John chapter 6, the people were considering what he was saying, but then they said, wait a second, we know Jesus. We knew his father Joseph, we know his mother Mary, we know his brothers, we know his sisters, we know he was a carpenter, we know he's not special. And now he's saying he's the bread of life. We don't believe him. And in verse 52, the Jews still don't believe him. They begin to argue sharply among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Now, in a sense, they're saying that because they don't understand what Jesus was getting at. They don't understand that he's trying to tell them something, to teach them a lesson. Is he going to cut himself up into pieces and give himself to us? Is this like some weird cannibalism thing? That's what they assumed, because they thought he was crazy. So in a sense, they don't understand him, but at the same time, they don't respect him either. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? This man we know. This man, we know his father and his mother and his siblings. This man we don't respect. How can this man give us anything? But if they believed Jesus' words, if they believed that he was the bread of life, that he was the only thing that could possibly give them nourishment and strength to keep on going day after day, if he was the only way they could get to heaven, they would have spoken differently and behaved differently and pursued him every day with a strength that wouldn't wear out, because he would be the one renewing it. You know, if we really believe Jesus' words, we would act differently too. When we would say a prayer before a meal, asking God to bless it, we would treat the prayer as more important than the meal itself. This is my chance to be close to God once again. He is my bread of life. He is what I'm most excited about. This prayer isn't just something that I'm saying to get out of the way so that I can get to the food. This is really the most important part of this whole experience. And so when I come to church, it's an opportunity to once again have my faith strengthened with the bread of life. What an incredible thing that God would give himself to me like that. Here's the Bible. Here are the words that the bread of life would have me consume and be strengthened by. What an incredible gift. I want to read this as much as I have an opportunity to do so. If we really believed that Jesus was the bread of life, wouldn't you and I act much differently? In that case, I suppose it's a good thing. Now, Jesus doesn't talk about how strong one's faith must be to receive the bread of life. He doesn't say this is something you have to train your whole life for. You have to start at age 3 or 4 and work and work and work, and then I will finally accept you. Jesus was talking about his suffering and death. He said, I am the bread of life. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Not just to the good people, not just to the people who work hard, who are respectable Christians. I give myself for the life of the world. I give myself for these sinful people. I give my life and I die on the cross. I shed my blood. I give up my flesh and my blood so that they would be forgiven. And when you hear that message, that's when you're eating living bread in faith. That moment is when your faith is strengthened. Not by working hard, but by trusting in the one who would give up his life for you. You know, before today, I assumed that most of you, when you've read this section or heard it preached on before me even, have thought, you know what, that's probably talking about communion. And when you looked at the bulletin before you came in, you probably said, it's probably talking about communion. And you know what? That's okay. In fact, you're supposed to. You're supposed to read these words and think, wait a second, I'm reminded, at the very least, I'm reminded of communion. You know, when Jesus was explaining himself to those people who didn't understand him, Jesus could have made it easier for them to understand. He could have said, well, what I'm trying to say, what I've been trying to tell you for days and days now is I am the bread of life. I'm the one you trust in. I'm the one who gives you life. That's what I'm trying to say. He didn't say that. He made it harder for them to understand. Oh, you don't like me saying that I'm the bread of life? Well, how's this? You have to consume my flesh. You have to drink my blood. Leviticus chapter 17 says you are not allowed to drink blood. So if they weren't offended before, they certainly were now. And Jesus is talking about resurrection as well. So for the certain Jewish people who didn't believe in the resurrection, if you've ever heard of the word Sadducees before, there was a certain group of people, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They thought you live and you die and that's it. So he's just offended them too. But he wrote, these words are recorded in this way, and Jesus said these words for our benefit. So that after the fact, we could look back and say, wait a second, I know communion wasn't around yet. I know the Lord's Supper hadn't been established, but I see what he's trying to get at. In faith, we receive the bread of life, and our faith is strengthened. And when we receive his body and his blood, which is something we need, our faith is also strengthened. Jesus gave up his body and blood for you and for me. And when we receive communion, our faith is strengthened by that once again, by being told your sins are forgiven. And we believe that. And that's why we act the way we do. That's why we value it so highly. That's why we come forward and receive that promise once again, your sins are forgiven in Jesus. Not because you've worked for it, not because you deserve it, but because Jesus gives it to you for free. I look back at my old notebooks and I think this poetry is terrible. But I believe that poetry can be done well. I've read books that have poetry in them, and most of them I didn't like, but some of them I did. I thought, wow, the way that that poet constructed those words and put them together, and it was missing conjunctions and things like that, but it really communicated something to me. I appreciated that. I felt like it taught me something about myself, even. I think we can do that. I think there are enough good minds here at St. James that we could start a poetry club. Let's pick a night when no one's busy. Let's have it on Fridays. Friday night, 6 p.m., everybody come here, and we'll sit around in a corner and we'll just write poetry. You just write whatever's on your mind, and we'll call it poetry. And probably it'll be terrible, but eventually it'll get better and better, and then maybe we can publish a book. It can be the poetry of St. James. The Book of St. James, how's that? That sounds pretty good. Maybe not. We don't have the time or energy to be the world's best poets. We have real life to take care of. We have other responsibilities. We have other goals. Being a poet is probably not the top of your list. But if you wanted to be a good poet, you'd have to work and work and work at it. If you want to be a good Christian, you can work and work and work at it. But that won't change a thing. That won't make God love you. That won't give you faith. But faith is something that God gives you freely. It's something that he gave himself so that you would receive. Jesus gave up his flesh and his blood. He died so that we would be forgiven. And when you read his word, when you pray to him, when you receive Holy Communion, when you're focusing on your faith, that's when you're the closest to him. So let's keep on worshiping together. Keep on celebrating the sacrament together. Let's keep on eating living bread in faith. Amen.